Hello, welcome back to Willowbrook Revisited. My name is Diane Buglioli, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director at a very special place, which provides services to individuals with developmental disabilities here on Staten Island. But today I'm actually here in my role as the co-chairperson of the Willowbrook Property Planning Committee. That's a committee of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council, which is the primary advocacy group here on Staten Island for people with developmental disabilities. Willowbrook Revisited, these segments are really a retrospective look at Willowbrook State School, the property it was on, the people who lived there, the people who worked there, the events that happened because of it, and the society in which it existed. I'm very, very pleased today to be able to have with us someone who was so instrumental in many of the things that occurred at Willowbrook in terms of the resolution of the issue that was Willowbrook, this total care institution that probably should have never existed. And with us today is a person who is an attorney, a litigator, I think a gladiator. He's an author now, and we'll talk about his book. But really at the heart of it, Murray Schneps is a parent, and a parent of action. So he's going to tell us today about his journey that started back in the 1960s and bring it to today. The story that he tells in his book, which is called I See Your Face Before Me, is about his daughter Lara. And it's really, he calls it a father's promise, but I always saw it as a father's love story to his daughter. And I'm so pleased to be able to have him here and for the audience to get to meet him and to hear his story, which I think is so important. And it's important also because it's relevant, because some of the things that he's going to talk about you'll recognize, because some of the things that he's going to say are things that are happening today. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Murray Schneps.
Hello.
Hi.
Good to be here. Thank
you so much for coming. Murray, let's start at the beginning. Let's start back in 1968, in the beginning of this journey for you. You're a young man, you're an attorney, you're married, and you have your first child. And this journey really begins with Lara. And there was so much texture to this story. And if you can go back with us and share the beginning of that, and then we'll go through the journey a little bit together today.
Well, Lara was born on May 23rd, 1968. And that was expected to be a wonderful, fabulous day. From the very beginning, her birth was very, very slow and difficult, and retrospectively, I know how difficult it was. We were trying to just get her out and live, and we thought we finally got that done after she was delivered, and within an hour after that, she turned blue while she was in the nursery, and that was the beginning of, I guess, a very, very sad story. It turned out that brain didn't really recover after that. She could have had some other problems in connection with prior to the birth, and she became to be a profoundly retarded person, an infant from the day she was born until the day she died, almost 18 years later.
So, you know, the first reaction any parent has, all of those emotions, you know, that, you know, now life is going to be different for this child that you have. But then comes the point, as you've described it in your book, and I would recommend any person, any parent, particularly parents who have children with special needs, any grandparent who has grandchildren, anyone who works in the field, that they read Murray's book. I think it's a journey that he shares, but there's so much to this journey, because it's not just the story of Lara. It's all of the changes that really took place because of Lara, actually, in a way, because it motivated her father to do some pretty remarkable things in our field. So the first thing that grabbed me, Murray, is there was really a lack of of help for you? In other words, the resources that existed in that time, right?
Well, my ex-wife at that time was a teacher, and as you said, I was an attorney. So we were aware of the fact that it was most important for Lara to be optimized in terms of what she could be and how much she could do. And we did know that she needed considerable help, although early on as an infant, we weren't really certain. We did know at a very early date that we wanted to locate for her programming for her to go to for rehabilitation or habilitation, whatever the words were at that time. She certainly was not going to learn how to read as a 2-month-old, but there were things that she had to do. She was unable to hold her head well, she couldn't sit well, and there were a lot of things that had to happen before she could go beyond. And in 1968, there were no programs whatsoever that existed for young children like Lara. And we searched and searched and searched, and the more we searched, we learned that there was even less than we even dreamed that there was. And one day, we did learn that this infamous place called Willowbrook had a relatively new children's center for programs for children, and they told us they could provide those services to Lara, but Lara had to become admitted to Willowbrook. That was pretty shocking, but we were willing to do just about anything in order to see to it that she did get some programs.
I mean, you wanted her to thrive. I mean, this is what a parent wants, for the child to thrive.
We wanted her to have the opportunity.
Yeah. So you one of the places that then you find that's available as a resource is Willowbrook State School.
Well, it wasn't one of the places. It was the only place.
For children.
There was no
for
other
children.
place.
That's right. In fact, it had just been built, right? Murray, I think it was built in around 1968, if I'm right.
That's,
67, 68, right?
That therapy center was about that time.
Right.
So it was relatively new. It was very, it was very conducive for us to go, because there was a series of buildings. Actually, there were 5 buildings called the baby buildings, and they were sort of in a semicircular setup. There were 3 in the front, 2 in the back, and there was a lot of space in between. And what they did is they developed and built the therapy center right in that property, right between all of those 5 pieces, buildings, and they had corridors running
between them,
from each one of those buildings into the therapy center. So the encouragement also was, which sounded pretty smart to me, that if it's raining, the kids don't even have to go in a wet area. They'll just drive them right into the program, and they're going to have all these wonderful programs, and they had all these buildings, and they had various equipment and rooms. It sounded like a dream come true, something that we never thought existed, and here it was for us just at the right time. I always thought that I was a very lucky person, so that made kind of sense to me that it would happen.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, after not too long a period of time, we learned that that this was not true, and this was really a misrepresentation of facts. The program was just a place that they harbored the children. They just went in there, they sat around, they'd bring them lunch, and that was about it. There was no therapy going on whatsoever that I could ever notice.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, we know that the facility was going through some budget cuts as well. The budget cuts maybe came in the early 70s,
Yes, the budget cuts
right?
began about 1970, and
So whatever the staff they had was starting to be cut anyway.
it was being cut. All the cut was being, well, it was also becoming a dangerous place in that number of deaths were climbing, And the kinds of people who were dying were people like my Lara. There were people who were like infants who were completely incapable of providing any services for themselves.
So what were the types of things that you yourself as a parent, what was it that you were starting to say, there's something really wrong here? We need to do something different than what we're doing.
Well, it was a little bit slow for me. I always thought I was really smart, but I guess we kind of had we developed a little bit of a commitment to see to it through with her and that she would do well. I think that once we moved her from our home to the institution, there was a change of attitude, but we kept trying to improve conditions there. We also, I guess, were half sleeping in believing that everything was good at Willowbrook, and there were a couple of things that worked out. One is that Lara was a very, very beautiful little girl, and she had red hair and kind of greenish gray eyes, and she would smile at anybody and everybody in spite of the fact that she was deaf, could not speak, and could not even lift her head up. But she was a very beautiful, sweet little girl, and the staff liked her a great deal. They kept her right in the front of the ward, so she always had a lot of attention. And amazingly, which I use that as a very important measure for me, that during the years, which is about 2 or 3 years, that Lara lived in Willowbrook, she never, ever had a rash, which I thought was incredible, because on several occasions, Lara did have to go to a hospital, and she went to NYU in Manhattan, and as soon as she was ready to go home, she would develop a diaper rash, and we knew it was time to take her home.
Yeah.
But Willowbrook, she never had a diaper rash. I figured, oh, that's an amazing place. They're really taking care of her. And so we were able to believe that baloney to ourselves, that was really happening.
So what was it then where did the change come, Murray? When did you say, wait a minute?
Well, during the time of the budget cutting, I spent an awful lot of time in Willowbrook, going from building to building, meeting with politicians, with the newspaper. We were also beginning to pound the tables and demand services and money for all the children. And I used to take people around to the different buildings. And on one particular day, I took a group of people to Building 16, which was one of the babies' buildings, and right next door to Lara's building. And I was really explaining to those who were sitting there, I was educating them with looking at the building to understand what was going on inside that building. And you'll excuse me, that the place was a shit house. And whatever you think it isn't, it is, and I explained to them why. And while we were talking about that, one of the people in the group asked me where my daughter Lara was living. And I relatively quickly answered that she was living next door in Building 14. And Building 14 and 16 and 18, I think it's 22 and 23, were the 5 baby buildings. And they were 5 identical buildings. They were laid out identically. The children were identical, other than there were different names and different people. And I realized for the first time that Building 16 was a crab house similar to Building 14. And when that happened, that was kind of the beginning of the end of Lara being at Willowbrook. It had also taken some more years. I became more and more of an advocate and became to look more and more about what was doing, not just alone how things were being done, with Lara, but how are things doing elsewhere in the institution? I had also thought that as an attorney, I could always make a living, and if necessary, I could just raise as much money as I needed and have a place for Lara to live, and always be maintained and taken care of. Except I had one problem, and that problem was that I was really anticipating and expecting and hoping that, I wouldn't say hoping because I believed that it would be, that Lara would outlive me. And I couldn't assure that she would be fine after I died. So I changed my point of view, and my point of view became one of making sure that every person who was developmentally disabled living in the state of New York would have a good place and be safe. And I believe that only by letting everyone there being safe, I could assure that Lara would be safe. And that was the beginning of my work in advocacy, in aiming at doing three things. One is closing Willowbrook. Two, making sure that all people would be placed in group homes and other small residential facilities no larger than 3 beds, and that Lara would be placed in such a facility. I was successful in all of them as far as Willowbrook is concerned, in that number one, Willowbrook was closed, and lately there are essentially no institutions operated by the state in New York, and Lara lived her last years in an apartment a couple of blocks away from our home, in a 3-bedroom apartment with her and 2 other children.
Well, you accomplished those goals, but and also that middle one that says, and you took the whole group of people with her, because your daughter's name became one of the plaintiffs in the judgment that was brought
Yes.
against the state of New York. Before I go there to the review panel and that piece, when you were first at Willowbrook, you know, at that time the institution was run and it was headed by Dr. Hammond, I believe,
Yes.
Dr. Jack Hammond, right? So at first, as a parent, you brought your concerns to the local people that were in charge, which would have been. When we spoke, you said that he was a psychiatrist in training. So, his training rather was that. So, what was the feeling of the staff that were there at the time in terms of your concerns about the standard of living, the lack of sufficient staffing, the lack of the therapies that were initially promised to you in terms of this is what we're going to do at this baby unit, as it was called. So what was their first response to you when you went to them?
Went to them bringing Lara home?
No, when you went to them to say, these are my concerns. I'm not pleased with this.
I was knocking on the door quite a bit. I mean, we were involved. We had a period of time that there was the union called a strike, and there were a lot of problems in Willowbrook. And due to the fact that Willowbrook at that time was in the news, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I avoid using the word thousands. It could have even been thousands. People came from all over the country to work in Willowbrook to help take care of those kids. And I remember one day being upstairs in the administrative building for some reason, and Jack Hammond, who was the director, Dr. Jack Hammond, was there with some of the parents from the Benevolent Society, people who were stayed close to him, let's put it that way. And they was sitting in there feeling sorry for poor Jack Hammond, that all this stuff was going on. Poor Jack. Well, nothing bad was happening to Jack Hammond. And as a matter of fact, having all of those hundreds and hundreds of people coming in to help in Willowbrook was a wonderful thing. But wonderful thing that they were complaining about was what's going to happen when these people all leave and all of the people living in Willowbrook are going to have to live there with fewer people. So I thought that was pretty odd, that they thought it was going to be a sad thing, that they would have terrific few days. That was going to be a terrible thing. So I didn't have a great deal of respect for Dr. Hammond, and I didn't think he was making any real efforts to improve conditions in Willowbrook, but retrospectively, again, he was doing as much as he was able to do. He certainly wasn't a kind of aggressive person that I was, otherwise he wouldn't have had that kind of a job as a psychiatrist in that facility. To me, it seemed to me that any person who was doing that kind of job in those days, who was a psychiatrist, was hiding from the world and like this nice, quiet place where he could be like a little fiefdom, where he was really in charge. So he was, and I didn't have that much to do with him. The next time I had very much to do with him was when people thought that I was being a little bit too active, and they decided to move Lara's bed from the front of the ward into the bowels of the ward, where she could not be seen and dealt with on a regular basis. And when I realized that happened, I actually called Geraldo Rivera, told him a story. I told him it really was a good story, and we went to Willowbrook the next day, and I confronted Hammond and told him what I thought was going on, and that they're trying to manipulate, me with my child, and they better stop it, and that he is going to be personally responsible, and I mean personally, if anything happens to my daughter in the meantime. And by the end of the day, Lara was returned to that place.
Yeah, and when I encourage everyone to get the book, of course, and but the pictures that are in the book also are something that people who don't have a history of what occurred at Willowbrook, they just don't have a vision of how bad things can really get. And when Murray's describing this room with the beds in it, there's hardly any space in between them. And so for Lara to be up front is very important so that she can be visually seen by maybe 1 or 2 staff that are working with maybe 60 children at one time. So it's an incredibly understaffed situation and becomes a dangerous situation.
It was a very dangerous situation. Young children like her were dying. There were enough staff to feed them. I mean, it took my ex-wife and I, when Lara was home, and she was home almost every weekend, it would take anywhere between 30 minutes and an hour to feed every meal for her. She could only eat food that was strained, and she couldn't swallow very well. She didn't have very good tongue control, so swallowing was very difficult. Half went in, half went out, and usually when she was trying to swallow, sometimes the tongue went in the wrong direction, pushed it out instead of in. And it was very dangerous also that food could go through the lungs.
She would aspirate on food,
an awful lot of those people died from it.
So the thought of maybe 2 staff with 60 people trying to feed.
Well, there were, it was interesting. In the baby buildings, each baby building, there were 5 of them.
Right.
There were rectangular buildings, and in the corners, in the 4 corners, there were separate wards. There were 2 wards on one side, to the right, to the left, and 2 wards on the right-hand side. And each corner and each one of those wards had 50 children. So in each one of those buildings, you had 100 children. So there were 100, there were 200 children in each building. So there were 1,000 children in that building.
Yeah.
And the last day that Lara was ever in Willowbrook was, I think it was in February. I'm not sure whether it was Washington or Lincoln's birthday, whichever one it would be. It would be a little bit more interesting if it was Lincoln's birthday. I think it may have been. We brought her home, and we met. The staff person was weeping. She had been alone in the building, alone on her side of the building, there was one attendant for 100 children in 2 rooms. And on the other side, there was one for 200 on the other side. And they were scared. I mean, they were scared that bad things could happen, and bad things could have happened very easily.
Absolutely.
And we took care of things. We straightened it out a little bit. We brought in whoever was in charge. We made sure they had some staff, and then we took Lara out. She never went there again.
So around the same time, we have Geraldo Rivera, the expose is occurring, right? So now, with the expose, following the expose becomes the Willowbrook Consent Judgment.
Well, first was the lawsuit,
right,
which was filed in 1972.
Right.
Actually, the lawsuit was actually filed in March, I think on March 17th, 1972. And I think Lara was removed from Willowbrook on February 21st. So technically, although she was a plaintiff, she was not
She'd been discharged.
She was not discharged. I wouldn't discharge her.
You wouldn't discharge her till after the date.
I would never discharge her.
You didn't discharge her.
I told her I will not discharge her. They said, they would discharge her. I said, you can do whatever you're doing. I am not discharging this child.
Yeah.
She is going to be in Willowbrook forever.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a pain in your neck.
and it was. So tell us about the Willowbrook Review Panel. I don't think people know much about it. They know about the consent judgment. Then there's a judgment brought against the state of New York, and it basically says you need to reduce the size of the institution within a planned amount of time, with some immediate things happening. At least I think 2,000 people got moved very, very quickly. And then, not only that, but you're going to have to change the conditions of what's happening there. So there needs to be active treatment, what we define as active treatment. And they put together this Willowbrook Review Panel that would then oversee this whole thing being implemented. This is a massive charge that I don't think people really have a sense of. First of all, the movement of there were 6,000 people living there at the time.
5,700 by that time, when the lawsuit was filed.
Right? 5,700 people. They're going to move them into smaller locations. Some people are from all over the state, so they're moving people back to Brooklyn, Queens, whatever this is. Massive undertaking. But also what's happening is they're going to change what's happening wherever they are. The Willowbrook Review Panel is going to implement a plan of active treatment for the individuals. And that was a really important thing, that concept that people with disabilities should be receiving active treatment, interventions to facilitate their lives being better.
There was a provision in the Willowbrook Consent Judgment which instructed the Willowbrook Review Panel with the obligation of developing a community placement plan. Right. And that community placement plan was designed by the Willowbrook Review Panel and experts that they hired to also do that. So you had the extensive detail of provisions of services that are required under the consent judgment, and incidentally, anybody who wants to find it can find a full copy of the Willowbrook consent judgment with the provisions in my website, murrayschneps.com, okay. And you can print out a copy for yourself. I think every parent, every advocate, every person in the field should read the consent judgment, particularly the provisions of what has to be provided, and those are about 20 pages, single spaced, are a real lesson as to what is needed, and people should know, and they're still applicable, should be applicable today. And then the Willowbrook Review Panel's job was to implement this stuff. And to me, it was a wonderful experience for me, particularly the other plaintiff members who were the Dr. James Clements, who became the chairman. There was myself, who was named as the vice chairman. There was Linda Glenn, who was a member, and Michael Lotman, who was an attorney, who was also a member. And we were the 4 people on a plaintiff's side, and the defendant's side had people that they designated, in essence, and there were 3 of them, and we knew we had a majority vote for everything, 4-3. So it was set up in a way that we could never lose, and we all agreed with each other. I mean, they were really a remarkable group of people. Actually, the other 3 people were pretty good too. They didn't really stop us from doing anything and agreed to a lot of what we had to say, but I never really trusted them completely to think that that they would really do the right thing. So we did our right thing, and they went along with it. They didn't go along with it. It really didn't matter. We had 4 votes, so mostly we did go to 7-0. But when we reached a little bit higher to the administration and to the, they were a little bit more reluctant. These are all high-level people. They didn't really want to smack those kinds of people, and I loved smacking those people up there because those things make sense and they get results. Smacking little people, that doesn't help.
You know, we've talked a little bit before when we were talking privately that, you know, how is it that at that time, right, here we have lack of resources for people with developmental disabilities. There's the breach of the promise when, as a young parent, you're bringing your daughter and you're thinking she's going to receive this intervention, this treatment. She's going to thrive to whatever her ability level is. And it's not happening. Was it the times? How is it that you were all able to mount? You know, after knowing you for a short time, I get a sense of your energy level and your motivation based upon your love for your daughter. So it was driving you, and you're still a driven person. How is it that it came to that place? How is it that the state of New York accepted? Why didn't they keep battling? Why did they relent at that point and say they accepted the judgment? What was it that was happening? Was the society changing a little bit to say, we have to make these changes now?
Well, there were a lot of questions in that, statement.
You know what I'm getting
and
to,
I'm
Murray.
going to try to handle all of them.
Okay.
First question is, I never accepted that there wasn't enough money. Never. It was never an issue for me with funding. I never addressed funding. I try to talk people now about prescriptions, designing prescriptions of what their children require and need. Mm-hmm. And that has to be provided, I think, as a matter of law and as a matter of ethics.
Yeah, I was going to say
that
morality.
These people need to be provided for what is necessary. Mm-hmm. And once you can get the experts to agree that this is what the child needs, that's what the child needs. Mm-hmm. Now you have to provide it. I don't have to tell you how much it has to cost. You figure out how much it has to cost. Mm-hmm. You just get this done. If you can do it cheaper, do it cheaper. More money, whatever. This is what has to be done. So I never really thought that we didn't have enough money. I remember when I first got involved and looked at some of the cases, it seemed to me at that time the budget for the Department of Mental Hygiene, which at that time undertook both the Bureau of Mental Retardation and the mentally ill, mm-hmm. And a few others, there was an awful lot of money available. Mm-hmm. I just felt that until the monies are applied appropriately, you're never going to know if there's enough money or not enough money. Yeah. One of my concepts in a lot of the litigation that I filed against the state was to try to bankrupt the state as much as I could. As long as they won't do things properly, let them spend a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Until they figure out they'll do it the right way. It's not that expensive. So I never thought that was really great of an issue. As far as the time of the judgment, it was like I'm forgetting the little phrase. It was like a crazy storm of all the right people came together at the one time. People like Mike Lotman and Chris Hansen and Bruce Ennis and myself and Linda Glenn and Jim Clements, and all these people had the ability to do these things. And the consent judgment was brought in. There was a lot of resistance to the lawsuit. The lawsuit was filed in 1972. It was not settled until 75. They began the trial. And then I'm trying to remember the name of the Attorney General, Lefkowitz. Lefkowitz was angry at the idea of this lawsuit, and he refused. He forced us to have the litigation, and I wasn't really that active in the litigation. That was being handled by the Civil Liberties Union people, and it finally reached the time that they were being embarrassed, with all and the pressure that we were putting on them and demanding that we were making, and we were winning, and so they went up, and then the people who drafted the consent judgment and came up with the consent judgment were absolutely genius, because such a thing doesn't exist anywhere else. I mean, the review panel was not only an unbelievable group of people, but the authorities that we had were remarkable. There was a formal recommendation process that was incredible, and as soon as I saw it, I said to myself, oh my God, we're just going to wreck these people. This is going to be easy. I mean, I never thought that that the state was a real challenge to me or us. We were smarter than them. We knew more, and we really gave a damn. Yeah. We really, really cared. Yeah. To me, I looked at everything through the eyes of my daughter. And if you wanted anything from me, I had to say, is this in our best interest or not our best interest? And if the answer was not in our best interest, my answer was no. And if I thought it was yes, then I would do anything to make sure that happened.
It's just absolute single-minded action, that was taking place, in a way. That was a standard. There's a standard of saying it has to reach this level or else it's just not acceptable.
Once we had the consent judgment, I remember attending Young Adult Institute's first annual conference, and they asked me to speak, and speaking before me was, I can't think of his last name, from OMRDD, and he unfortunately spoke before me.
He was a commissioner?
He was a deputy commissioner. And he told everybody, this is after the entry of the consent judgment, that the Willowbrook consent judgment was an aspirational document. And then I got to speak.
Oh, my.
And I absolutely humiliated this man, in every way I could possibly do. And let him know that this is not an
aspirational.
Such a document.
Yeah.
This was going to happen, and we were going to do this. And if they wouldn't, and I hope that he tries not to do it because he's going to go to jail. So once we had the consent judgment, and the state wanted more time for anything, and the state wanted to change anything, this was a judgment. This was an agreement. This wasn't flexibility. This wasn't a contract. This was a contract ordered by the court that the state agreed to, that they're going to do this, so they had to do absolutely everything. Nobody could say to me, well, Murray, why are you being so strict? I'm not so strict. I'm just doing what they said they want to do.
Right.
And they've agreed. So I wanted to do it as fast as I possibly could and as much as I possibly could do, because the state's attitude always was to delay. Lefkowitz, I think, tried to do that. They tried to do that until they reached the point that they were getting killed, and they settled the case. And, things began to, the state never really dreamed that we would have this tenacious spirits and that we would insist. They figured everything will go back to usual. They'll go do the things, they'll have the judgment, they'll leave us alone. But we never left them alone, and we never backed away. And the first thing that the Willowbrook Review Panel did was make a formal recommendation to the state, telling the state that any movement from anybody in an institution, in any one of the institutions, must go directly into community placement. You can't have an interim placement from an institution to an institution.
Institution to an institution. You just put somebody into a
to
smaller
go
institution.
directly into the group home. Now, I love that idea, and we did that, and we fought, and we were successful. The court didn't give us 100% what we wanted, but essentially they did. And the real issue that did exist, to understand that I did understand what was going on, to me, this all had to do with the residents and the parents. And I knew that not all the parents had the kind of background that I had and understood. And there was somewhat of a division among parents with regard to how we should provide services for the developmentally disabled. I was convinced that it was important to get people out of Willowbrook as soon as possible into group homes. Others thought that it made more sense to improve conditions in Willowbrook in the meantime, as it will take the time to open the group homes. And I felt that using that kind of money, or substantial money, in order to upgrade a place like that, it would also generate a feeling by the state to continue that place to exist.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Would play background, and I also felt it was more important to get them out forever. And so I felt honestly and badly about the other parents. It's just that I disagreed with them, and I pushed for what I wanted and would work out. And it did. It was working out great.
Yeah.
It was really working out great.
I just want to, just for the purposes of the audience, just say that Murray was involved in many different litigations, but the ones that I became aware of, I mean, I always knew about Willowbrook, and then being involved in the Willowbrook Review Panel and the litigation. But in Gouverneurs, you became involved in that process, where they were trying to close Gouverneur and move all those people to Willowbrook.
Not only there was another facility we were doing the same thing with.
Yeah, and there was Gouverneur, and then there was Hillcrest, which was a place up.
Hillcrest, that was something else.
Yeah, that was really something.
Did I tell you about Hillcrest?
Yeah, but let me just say before you do that, but also involved in the closing of Bronx Developmental Center, the closing of Suffolk Developmental Center, the closing of Hillcrest. I'm not sure if it was called Developmental Center, but closing of Hillcrest, and assisting with Gouverneur to be handled the way the families want it to be, and the closing of Willowbrook. So that's a pretty impressive grouping. But I want you to tell about Hillcrest, which was just a small piece in the book, but a very striking one.
One day, Jim Clements and I decided that we wanted to go visit the big institution in Westchester. I forget the name of it. And so we went. He came to New York, and I drove, and we went up there. And while we were walking around, because we would, talk to everybody, and we weren't there to criticize anybody so much. Our criticisms came to ourselves, but we wanted to kind of support people a little bit, and we wanted them to understand what we were doing and what was going on. And somebody told us about this place, Hillcrest. And they told us that there was this little prison called Hillcrest. So once we heard that, we kind of looked at each other and we both said, let's go to Hillcrest. So they gave us directions to go to Hillcrest. So we got in the car and we drove to Hillcrest. We really had no idea what we were going to see and what we were going to find. And when we came into the woods looked like a stone, beautiful big stone building. And this big stone building looked like one of these private schools that would have existed, years before.
Yeah.
And we knock on the door, and they of course knew we were coming because they always call in that we're coming.
Right.
So we tried to tell them we were going there.
The review panel's coming.
Because we were going there.
Yeah.
Oh, they all knew. But a lot of people, they didn't know what to do anyway. And we knock on the door, and we get into this place and start talking to people, and of course they get a little bit nervous. And we we just want to see what's happening. We want to help them and see what we can do. And there must have been about 18 young men who were living in this place. And we got a chance to meet everybody and spent a few hours in there with them and talked to everybody. And I was a kid from Brooklyn, and I could really size people up pretty fast in terms of who's independent, who's not independent. And it seemed to me, of the 18 or so people that were there, 17 out of 18 could have lived on their own almost immediately. It turned out that these people had all been moved from the different institutions that they had in Westchester to Hillcrest because they were all deemed to be too difficult to manage. In effect, they were sentencing them to prison without the benefit of
trial.
Of a trial.
Really.
And Jim and I went absolute bananas. After we did a lot of work and we got home, the next day, that was a Friday, on Saturday and Sunday was a weekend. We do we had on a weekend every month was a meeting of the Willowbrook Review Panel. We would meet in the city, and we all went there that morning, and all we had to do was tell about what we saw and what was going on. And the other panel members went nuts, except for one who was also the director of the facility. Not only that facility, but of all Westchester. Not the director, he would be the associate commissioner then.
Yeah.
What was his name? I can't remember his name. I'm embarrassed. But at any rate, and he was shocked. First thing was Jim said, "Jim, do you know this place?" He said, "No, I didn't know anything about this place." And we told him about this place, and they knew that we weren't telling baloney, that we would only tell them the truth, and they were shocked. As a matter of fact, Tom Coughlin, who was the commissioner, was there too.
Right, Tom Coughlin.
And their eyes almost came out of their heads. And we told them what was going on, and we made rulings right then and there as to what was going on. We want them to do evaluation of everybody. And it was my estimation that 17 out of 18 or 19 people, or then it would be 18 or 19, could be placed almost immediately. And one of them did have some activity problems in terms of behavior, was a little bit difficult to control, mostly because he was about 6'6" and weighed about 320.
Yeah.
So he was very difficult to physically manage. If this was somebody who isn't going to listen to you, you needed a wall to protect you.
Yeah.
So, but we wanted, and that took a long period of time to get this out. I mean, the commissioner, there was the other commissioner, Dr. Kolb, he didn't want to do any of this stuff. He was a psychiatrist, and they kept delaying, and they finally got everybody programmed and out.
Yeah.
And it was what a great feeling to save the lives of 18 people like that. It was just an amazing experience.
That's so.
But once we went there, we were not going to leave quietly.
That seems to be that's a theme that runs through your career.
Well,
yeah?
I just the worst thing you can tell me is tell me something can't be done, and it was then anyway. I mean, and when you talk about Gouverneur, I had a call on a Sunday night from one of the members of the Benevolent Society from Willowbrook, actually one of those women who was sitting yubba-bubbing with Dr. Hammond during the strike. And she said, listen, I just have this information that they are closing Gouverneur in this other place. Tomorrow morning, they're going to bring them in. She says, but I'm just letting you know, and this, it's in stone.
It's done already.
You can't change this. It's done. Don't even bother or anything. I'm just letting you know. Well, 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday, which is the next day, I was there, and my office was a few blocks away, and I went and I wanted to know I found out who's in charge, and I met Willie Mae Goodman, And they had, I mean, that place was like a military place. They had the young lords were there surrounding the place and, you know, looking me up and down, who was I? I mean, this young lawyer dressed up with a suit and a coat and all that stuff. I mean, I look like a lawyer too, you know, and they, you know, they were like in battle fatigues. And who is this guy? And what are you doing here? What are you doing? Well, I'm going to try to help. I said. He said, oh yeah, why are you going to help? I said, well, very simply, I shouldn't talk like that about them. But they were young kids, so that's the way I would have sounded when I was 15 years old also. And I said, I'm selfish. They said, oh, really? Oh, they started to listen. I said, yeah, I'm selfish. I don't want you kids to come into Willowbrook because my daughter is in Willowbrook and she's even more
Just more needs.
disabled
Yeah.
than any of your people there. Yeah. And if you move my daughter there, my daughter's going to die. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden I became their friend and they liked me and they listened and they did the things that I wanted them to do. I moved them inside the building rather than outside the fence where the police could beat the hell out of them. Not that I'm saying bad things about the police, but that's what have happened.
So as
I was there, then they had a yellow bus, school bus, come along to pick up all the people and bring them, which was kind of laughable because they had these you know, if you remember what they were inside. I mean, all these kids were multiply handicapped and twisted.
Yeah.
And how are they going to get them in there?
Into the bus.
They couldn't have got them into the bus.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a joke.
You know, we could talk for another easy, because we spoke to almost an hour before we started the taping, but I want to leave. We have only maybe 10 minutes left, 8 minutes left. Parents today, you know, we just came from a presentation that you did at the Vanderbilt for the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council. Parents today, Murray, they're facing in a very similar way some of the things that you faced.
They're actually facing a more difficult task.
Yeah.
And I do have a few words for them that would be helpful, things that I didn't get to say yesterday. I kind of inched at them, but I didn't have enough time. I think that things are more difficult now than they were in Willowbrook. When you went to Willowbrook and you showed people in Willowbrook, it was simple to understand that Willowbrook was a terrible place.
It's wrong.
You know, to call Willowbrook Auschwitz was not an understatement. Mm-hmm. To me, it was a place to kill people because you either generate life or life fades, and nothing was being done in Willowbrook to generate. And anybody could see that easily. These new facilities that they're doing now that are institutional anyway are much more difficult to identify and get other people to be upset about. Oh, it doesn't look so bad, you know. Because people really expect to see something really terrible, so they really need to be shocked. What is needed now is that the parents have stopped just asking things. They must begin to demand for what they want for their children, and they must be ready to take the next step and the next step and the next step. When they not get what they want, then the next challenge is to be more severe. And ultimately, as I have no faith whatsoever with with any of the political people for doing anything, I think we need a new lawsuit. I think we need a new class action that is a newly formed Willowbrook-type case to affect everybody throughout the state and reestablish what had been established before and upgrade everything to where it is with the facts that are applicable as they exist today. Because the law is not all that different. Something has to be expanded a little bit and more specific, but all these cases have to do with facts. And we have plenty of facts that make things pretty miserable. And when experts and parents are going to testify about the difficulties that the developmentally disabled are facing, and death which are facing, and institutionalization which they are facing already, it will be pretty clear to understand what's happening. And a new law, I have faith in litigation, especially with competent people, and there are competent people who will be committed to bring this further. And most important to all this is for every parent and every person who believes in, I know what this is, Staten Island, and I tried this in Staten Island too. Nobody booed me anyway. Unless and until the Supreme Court of the United States has a liberal majority, there will be no benefits really through litigation for the developmentally disabled. And if the conservatives control it again, I'm going to just die peacefully but very unhappy.
You know, there's always been an interesting dichotomy for me with people whose beliefs are with the right to life grouping, and that always meant to me, right to life is, and when I'm born too, I have the right to a life.
Well, I don't like right. I mean, I don't want to get too political, but to me, their right to birth, their right to be born. That's what they're not caring about right, because none of them do anything to help people like my child or any of the other children.
That's exactly my point.
Let them be born, and the hell with you.
That's exactly my point.
After that, no.
Yeah.
So people love to give fancy names for themselves, and then they can generate for themselves as being important and caring people. You want to be caring? Put your neck in the loose.
Let me read this one piece, and it's one of my favorite passages in here. You're talking about you went to see Children of a Lesser God, which is a play with deaf characters. The play is wonderful, but the title creates a wrongful impression. There's no different or lesser God for the handicapped. God must not be judged by the acts of man. There are only lesser people, and lesser people are not those who are handicapped in their ability to learn and walk. Lesser people are those who lack generosity of thought and action towards others. You know, it's a sentence that struck me, and I agree. And we need somehow to garner the actions of those of us who have a true motivation to impact upon the lives of people with developmental disabilities. And now is not a lesser time than in the 60s.
Not at all.
It is worse. I agree with you.
Well, my favorite quote of all, which I'm not sure if it's in the book, but it was in an article that is from New York Magazine, and that can be found in my website. And one of the things, when they were asking me about conditions in Willowbrook, I told everybody, and I'm trying to give the idea of what it was that I was said, and it was the very end of the article, and I said that, in Willowbrook we have this wonderful situation, which is fantastic. Willowbrook Consent Judgement is fantastic. Willowbrook Review Panel, nobody has this anywhere in the world, and it would be a shame. It would be a shame if we lose all this stuff because of prejudice. And what my concern is that we're going to be back to those goddamn institutions.
Yeah. Many people share that fear with you, and that's why it was so important for you to be here as a guest. I'm so thankful for you. I've thanked other people that have come here, but truthfully, in my heart, thank you for not only coming here today, but thank you for all the work that you did in the past. We talked about it before. I don't think you know how much you impacted. I don't think you know how much you accomplished. You should, I want to acknowledge that, and also to our audience. You did a wonderful job. You're a hell of a guy, and I'm so glad to have met you now. I just heard of you before. Murray Schneps is coming. But I'm so glad that you're here today. And Murray, thank you so very much.